couple of weeks ago, I wrote a blog post titled Order Matters, where I discussed the importance of considering the order of the plugins on your channel strip. And the reason being that two plugins can be ordered differently with the same parameters and give you a different result. And so last week I did a video where I showed you an example of two plugins where, without changing the parameters but changing the order, the sound of the track changed. I also gave you an example of two plugins with the same parameters that did not change the sound of the track when swapped in the order on the channel strip. And of course, the reason why it's possible that changing the order of these plugins will change the sound of your track is because the signals passing through the plugins in the order that they are organized on the channel strip. And so if the plugin that the signal first passes through changes the sound of the track, then that signal is then what gets passed to the next plugin. And when it comes to time-based effects in particular, but any effects whatsoever, this can really determine the ultimate sound. So it's very important that you think about the way that you want the signal to flow through that channel strip, through those plugins. And so I thought what I would do today is show you a typical order on, in my mixes, and kind of explain to you the thinking that went into this particular organization. So I've got the same piano piece here. And I've already got a couple of plugins turned on. And the reason why we're starting with those two plugins is because EQ and compression, those are extremely common in my mixes. Almost every track is going to have those two plugins, especially live instruments and vocals. So the reason why I like to start with EQ is because EQ is all about tone. And the reason why I put that before my compressor is because my first EQ on the channel strip will typically involve more cuts than boosts. And so when I'm compressing the signal, I am bringing the lowest parts of the signal up to match some of the higher parts. Of course, compression brings the signal down, but then when you gain match, you're ultimately going to bring it back up so that your highest peaks are back to where they started and your lower parts have been raised up. And ultimately this evens out the level of the track over time. And so the way I look at it, when I'm compressing a signal, I don't want to compress bad tone. So my first EQ, it's all about cleaning up the tone, and it's mostly going to be cuts. I might have a little boost here or there once in a while, but mostly you're going to see a lot of these cuts, especially high pass filters for particular tracks. Piano would be one of them. So then I've compressed the signal after that. And these are the two most important things. And so then we can get into the more interesting stuff. After my compressor, I might have more EQ. Now, why would I need a second EQ? Well, if I've got a second EQ on any particular track, it might be because I've run out of bands that I can work with. This is a 6-band EQ. It's got a high and a low pass filter and these shelves. So maybe I run out of bands and I need a second EQ for that, in which case I'd probably have it before the compressor, but that's rare. Most of the time, if I've got a second EQ, it's because I want to do something more creative with the tone, more artistic. And usually this is extreme boosts on particular frequencies, or more commonly, this telephonic effect where you've got a high and a low pass filter, usually pretty extreme. So just listen to what this EQ is doing to the tone of the piano. So because this is a creative move, I like to do this after the compressor, after the boring stuff. The EQ and the compressor are kind of the boring plugins. And since this EQ move with the telephonic effect is creative, I want to do it to a signal that has been cleaned up tonally with any cuts that it might need, and also been compressed so that it's flattened out a bit, so that it's more even. After that, and not always, but after that, I might have a distortion. I would say either or. And the reason I say that is because distortion in many ways is a tone-based effect as well. So maybe I'm not using this EQ, maybe I'm using a distortion. But in the event that I'm using both, typically I'm going to want to distort a signal that has been, again, tonally altered first, in the way that this EQ is altering the tone. See, this EQ is cutting a lot of frequencies. So the only reason why I might put the EQ after the distortion is if I need to boost particular frequencies. But honestly, I feel like if I needed to boost particular frequencies, the distortion was probably a bad move to begin with. Because what a distortion is going to do is alter the tone by adding tonal information. So typically what I'm going to do is I'm going to have an EQ that removes, and then I'm going to add tonal information with the distortion plugin to what's left. Because why would I want to add tonal information to frequencies that I'm only going to get rid of later with an EQ? So let's listen to what this distortion is now doing. Okay, so it's really starting to sound funky. And that's okay. This isn't about how to make a piano sound good. You know, I don't know that this piano you'd ever want this piano to sound this way, particularly on its own. Maybe in a mix in certain contexts. This is really just about the order of the plugins and why I like to organize them this way. So again, we have plain old subtractive EQ here, compressor, and then EQ that is a little bit more creative, artistic, then distortion, which is, again, tonal. Then we get into the more interesting stuff. So I like to use tremolos a lot. You know, this might apply to any modulation, chorus, you know, anything that's using modulation. But tremolo is a common one in my mixes. And because what a tremolo is essentially doing is affecting the volume over time, I like it to be later in the chain. If you put a tremolo too early in the chain, plugins that come after it can have an effect that you might not you want. And we talked about that with the tremolo and the reverb last week, how a reverb after a tremolo is going to wash out what the tremolo has gotten rid of. So typically I won't use both a tremolo and a reverb on the same track, you know, because they sort of fight each other. But if I'm going to have a tremolo, it's going to come later in the chain. Let's hear what this tremolo is doing to this piano. So, yeah, again, I don't know that sounds good, but it's doing what I want it to do. We're removing some frequencies, then we're evening things out, then we're removing a lot more frequencies, And maybe this, this second EQ here gets turned on and off throughout the mix. It's an effect that we want on certain parts, the bridge or the intro or whatever. Then we've got a distortion, which is adding more tonal information. It's getting the signal to break up a little bit, to sound sort of flattened and kind of in your face. And then we're using a tremolo to affect the volume over time. We're modulating it. So again, like we talked about last week, I'm typically not going to have a reverb after a tremolo. We're going to turn this tremolo off. But let it be known that a time-based effect like a reverb, a delay, in my opinion, those are better off later in the chain. And the reason for this is that they are really changing the sound of your track. Now, I should also point out that I usually won't use a reverb or a delay directly on the channel strip. Usually I'm going to be using sends. I'm going to send to bus 1 or bus 2 and blend in the delayed or the reverb signal with the dry track. That's typically how I work. But in the event that I use a reverb or a delay directly in the channel strip, it's going to come later. Again, this is because you're really messing with the sound of that track. If you add a reverb, it's time-based. It's going to create a sound, over time that wasn't there before. A reverb is in many ways like a very fast delay. And so you're going to hear those tails, and what comes after the reverb or the delay on that channel strip is not just going to affect the original signal, it's going to affect those tails as well. And so in my experience, in my opinion, it's best to use those time-based effects at the end, or as I mentioned, just send them, send them in a way that the other plugins will not have any effect on them, that it can kind of be a separate effect that can be blended in. So let's just listen to what is happening now with this distortion being the last thing before the reverb and the tremolo has been turned off. All right. So that pretty much covers it. This is very unusual. I wouldn't typically have a channel strip that looks exactly like this. There's a lot of plugins, a lot of different effects going on. But I wanted to give you the most extreme case and tell you how I would order these plugins. There really is no right or wrong way with this. This is just what I feel is the most efficient way to get to the sound I'm looking for when it comes to plugins and their order on the track. I'd love to know what other people think about this, the way that you like to order your plugins. Just let me know in the comments below if there's a technique that you find to be more useful when it comes to this stuff, or if you have learned something here today, if you think that this is valuable information. Let me know if you have any questions or suggestions down below. I hope that this was helpful, or at the very least, an interesting look into the way that I like to order my plugins on the channel strip. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your mixing for the day, for the week, for the month. Have a good one. Bye.